Grandma always said that Grandpa wasn't right. I've been taking care of my grandma lately. She's been doing pretty bad, and she needs someone there to help her almost 24/7. She's got some kind of bone disease. It's basically turning her bones into Swiss cheese, and I've had to carry her to the bathroom and room to room for the past 2 weeks. This might seem kind of tiresome to some people, but I'm glad to do it. My grandma and I have always been close. She basically raised me since my mother was never at home. If I can give back to her now, I consider it fair. She's been alone since I was in high school, and those 10 years have been the happiest I've ever seen her. She and Grandpa had been married for decades, 50 years before Grandpa left, but they never seemed to get along. When I was young, Grandma would always come over and stay the night instead of having me come over there. Grandpa never came to our house. He mostly stayed close to home or went to work, but the few times I interacted with him, he seemed way off. Even as a kid, I didn't think he looked right. That might sound a little mean, but over time he got paler and less coherent. He would mumble to himself, this odd whispering thing he did while he was watching TV, and Grandma usually kept him in the bedroom with the lights off and the TV on. He disappeared suddenly when I was in the 9th grade, and it had been almost as much of a relief to me as Grandma. So last week when I slid her into bed and told her we were going grocery shopping the next day, so she better get some sleep, she shook her head and looked away. I doubt I will. I think this might be my last night in this bed. Why? I asked, thinking she was joking, you eyeing my bed. I'll swap with you, but yours is much more comfortable than the one in the No, son. She cut me off, her voice thready and weak. I think tonight's the night that I pass on. My eyes got big. Do I need to call Miss Sam? If you think you're about to pass, then I should get the nurses out here I don't want them here. You've been good to me, kid. I just want you here with me at the end. Besides, I need to tell you something. I need to confess my sins before I take them to heaven with me. I can call Pastor Ferris over here. If you need to talk to someone about matters spiritual, no, not Bobby Ferris either. I want to confess to you. It's family business, and once I confess it to you, it'll be your burden to carry after I'm gone. Gracieled Sessions, thinking that I might not want this secret. As I looked at my grandmother's face, I had seen that face smile more than anything else. But the look she had now reminded me of something else I had seen when I was young. It's something I hadn't noticed until I looked back through the lens of time. But Grandma had always seemed a little nervous whenever she stayed at our house. And I caught her more than once checking the doors and windows, looking through the living room curtains as if expecting to see someone there. And it always made me think she was scared of someone. This look that always made me think a stranger was trying to get in so they could take me. The truth, it seemed, was darker than that. I sat down on the bed, willing to listen as little as I wanted to. I'm here, Grandma. If you need to tell me something, then I'll listen. Grandma nodded, looking out the dark window of her bedroom like someone might be there. Your granddad didn't disappear, she said, wetting her lips with his wrinkled tongue. I killed him. That was a shock, and my face must have said as much. She smiled without much mirth. Didn't think your old grandma was capable of something like that, huh? No, it's just surprising. You guys lived together for decades. I'm not sure why you would choose 10 years ago, though. That wasn't the first time, she said, her voice as thin as a spider web. I killed your grandpa for the first time in 1973. 10 years ago was just the last time I had to kill him. I was confused and I said as much, but Grandma only nodded. Your real grandpa died in 1972, but he didn't stay dead. She laid it all out, something that took us nearly into the next day. But she never stopped looking out the window as she spoke. I realized now that she was looking for Grandpa. When the call came, I was pregnant with your mother. Your grandpa had avoided the draft by attending college and had managed to avoid it again with a waiver from the government. He was an engineer working on bridges and sewer systems in DC, and I was looking forward to having him home in a few weeks. He had promised to come home before the baby was born, and he was excited to meet his daughter. We had wanted children for years, and when we talked, you could hear the tears on the verge of coming out whenever we talked about our future. The phone call that day, however, seemed to be the end of that dream. They said he had been killed in a car accident and that it had been very quick. He had been driving to a job site when someone had run a red light and slammed into the driver's side door. They said he died instantly, hadn't suffered a bit. And I suppose that should have been a mercy. They wanted to bury him in the Capitol, but I was adamant that he be buried here. I wanted his daughter to see him, to know her father, but I couldn't have known how much she would know him. A week later, before his body was even home, I heard someone in the kitchen late at night. Grandma's voice got low, the husk making my skin crawl as she stared through the little window into the past. I must have looked a sight as I came out with a baseball bat, but he never saw me coming. It was a man in military fatigues, eating a sandwich and sitting at my kitchen table like he owned the place. He hadn't bothered to turn on any lights, and the closer I got, the more I saw. He had left a duffel bag on the floor beside him, and there was a glass of milk sweating on the table beside his plate. His fingers slipped into the white bread, and the lettuce and tomato looked wet against the roast beef poking out. I didn't challenge him. I don't think he ever even knew I was there, and when I hit him in the side of the head, he went down like a sack of potatoes. I killed him in one hit, hit him just right. But when I went to see who he was, I felt like I might have a heart attack. It was your granddad. He was laid out on the floor, bleeding from the ears, has blood staining his fatigues. I looked up the pins he had been wearing years after the fact and realized he had been a corporal in the army. His paperwork said he was back on leave for the birth of his child, and he was on 2 weeks of leave before he had to return to Vietnam. I was confused. My husband had never been in the army, and as I sat there trying to figure out what to do, I decided to just bury him in the backyard. My husband was dead, and calling up the police to let them know that this man had broken in so he could eat a sandwich would only muddy the waters. So I buried him in the backyard. No easy feat for a woman who's 7 months pregnant. 3 days later, I was sitting in the living room, folding laundry and just trying to get back to normal when I heard keys in the front door. I heard someone come in, set their bag down on the end table, and then I heard the last voice I ever expected to hear. Sorry, I'm late, dear. There was something in the office I had to set up for tomorrow before coming home. It was your grandpa dressed in a crisp white button-up and press suit pants. His tie was blue and white, something I had never seen before and looked expensive. I had never seen any of these clothes before, and I was the one who did all the laundry. He spread his arms wide, waiting for a hug, but I couldn't move. I had killed him 3 nights ago. I watched him die. And as I backed away from him, I saw his face twisting in confusion. It was a painful look, a look that hurt my heart. What's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost. It's me, it's Wendell, your loving man. I was against the door frame, hyperventilating, clutching my stomach as your mother kicked inside me. She could sense my fear, feel my uncertainty, and she was responding in kind. He took a step towards me, and I curled into a ball as I tried to protect myself from whatever he meant to do. I expected him to try to attack me, to turn into a vengeful spirit and come after me, but instead he just wrapped his arms around me and hugged me close. What's wrong, darling? Are you okay? Talk to me? It sounded just like him, and when I wrapped my arms around him, I realized it felt just like him too. The smell of his aftershave, the rasp of his 5 o'clock shadow on my cheek, the way his hair smelled like Selsun blue. It was all things that let me know it was him. When he hugged me to him, I gasped as I felt the lump on his inner arm where a birth defect had left a bone poking slightly out. It was him, it was your granddad, and I just leaned into him and sobbed as he helped me to my feet and took me to the bedroom. I checked the back of his head later that night as he slept, but there wasn't a mark or anything to lead me to. I believe he had been the one I clobbered a few nights ago. I lived with this version of your grandpa for 6 months. He worked as a manager at a paper company, his degree in business instead of engineering, and he made a comfortable living for us. If I needed a reminder of the old times, however, I only had to look at the graduation photo hanging in the hallway. It was me and your grandpa, him in his cap and gown and me, in my best dress, smiling as his mom snapped a photo. I caught him looking at the picture sometimes, trying to rationalize it, before finally moving away to do whatever he had been heading out to do. He was there for the birth of your mother, and I settled into a life of maternal bliss. Your grandfather was much the same as he had always been, trading talk of bridges for talk stocks and paper sales, but he was still the same man he had always been. He loved your mother and me dearly. We never wanted for anything, but after a while, I suspected that something was off about him. It started with the sleep talking. He would mumble ceaselessly from the time his eyes closed till the time he opened them. Your grandfather had always been a prolific snorer, even since he was little, as his mother liked to say, but now he never seemed to breathe at all when he slept. He would mumble on and on about sewers and the war in stocks and paper, and raising dogs and breeding horses, and a million other things. Between your mother's nightly feedings and your grandfather's ceaseless muttering, I was becoming ragged. I couldn't sleep with all that yammering, and no matter where I slept, it always seemed to find me. I ratchetted it until one night when I heard something familiar. I came awake to the sound of someone chewing and mumbling. Where are they? Chew, chew, chew. I can't believe I had to make my own food. It's not enough that I chew, chew, chew went and fought them for her, but now I have to make my own sandwich. I have been sleeping on the couch trying to get some sleep away from the muttering. And as I crept up the hall listening to him mumble, and even the squeak of the door didn't rouse him from his nightmare. She couldn't even bother to wait for me. Choo choo choo, just because my bus was a little late, I'm a war hero, a soldier, and she can't even choo choo. But he paused them before gasping harshly, ouch my head. What the hell was that? It's Maggie. Oh my God, she's killed me. She killed me. She bashed my head in with a bat. I'm dead on the floor. Dead right by my kitchen table, my blood's going everywhere. She killed me, she killed me, The pillow was over his face before I could stop myself. I was just so ragged, so mentally fried, that I knew he would tattle on me. He'd wake up and tell the police, and they would find the body, and he'd be here alone with your mother, and who knew what would happen then? He wasn't her father, couldn't be her father. And he might hurt her or kill her, or she looked back at me and I could see her eyes swimming with tears. He only struggled a little, and then I had another body to bury. She was quiet for a moment, her eyes returning to the window before continuing again. The next one was a car salesman. But he was less like your grandfather than the one before. I read something about how if you photocopy a photocopy, the quality will degrade until it's almost unrecognizable. That was how this was. The next one sounded less like your grandfather, was paler than him, and seemed to get lost sometimes. I lived with this one for 2 years until he suddenly wandered into traffic outside our house. I told the police that this one was a cousin of my late husband, and that was why he looked so similar. The one after that bred horses. And when one threw him, I buried him at the edge of the range where he worked and went home expecting another one. I was becoming pretty good at losing husbands by now. And when the next one showed up, I hit him with a frying pan and left him in the backyard with the others. By the time your mother came home from school, there was a new one in the living room reading the paper. Over the years, I've experimented with how durable they are. I pushed one off the roof after asking him to help me fix something. He broke his neck and I added him to the growing mass grave out there. I poisoned one over the course of a year until he dropped dead one morning over his oatmeal. I pushed one off a mountain during a hike, only to return to the hotel and find a new one there waiting for us. The copies became paler and less coherent, their voices becoming softer and less substantial. It got to the point that he couldn't hold a job. His mind was like that of a dementia patient, and I would look up sometimes to find him watching me through the window of wherever I was. Your mother had moved out of the house by now, a retirement check from somewhere showing up in the mailbox from a company that manufactured pipes. The money was good, the money kept us afloat, but I was tired of living with this pale ghost. Then, 8 years ago, he walked out of the house one morning and never came back. In many ways, it was a blessing. I had become responsible for him. I had taken care of him and led him around like a child, and now I was responsible for just me. Lassie Lanchancy, I kept cashing those checks until they stopped coming about a year ago, and I kept waiting for the day when he might come back. I almost dreaded it because it would mean that he had died and a new pale copy would take his place yet again. Grandma turned away from the window, locking eyes with me as the night slid by outside. Now it's your secret. It's your secret and your burden. The bodies in the back are still there. I checked periodically, and though they decompose, the bones remain. I don't know if this version of your grandfather will ever come back, but you will have to watch for him now. I've left everything here to you, the house, the accounts, everything. It's yours now, and I pray it brings you joy. She lay down then, and I could almost watch the life slip out of her. By midnight, she was dead, and when I turned to get the phone, I saw what she had been waiting for at the window. Gramps was paler than I remembered him, but he looked exactly the same. Otherwise, he waved at me as he stood there before backing away and leaving the way he had come. I went to the backyard and looked, but there was no one there and no clues that anyone had been there in the first place. We buried Grandma in a plot next to Grandpa's original plot, and she lay peacefully there beside her husband. The caretaker tells me that someone comes to see her, though, leaving a single wildflower behind before moving on. I don't think he'll be back again, but who's to say what the future might bring? In the meantime, I called the police and let them know about all the bodies in the backyard. The sheriff came and exhumed them, asking all kinds of questions that he didn't seem to believe the answers to. He had them tested and, to his surprise, all of them came back as a match for my grandfather. Dental records, DNA, hair samples, it all came back a match, and they were all left scratching their heads. They couldn't really charge my grandmother with it. You can't put a dead woman in prison after all, and they were left with a mystery for the ages. Either way, it's nice to have the bodies gone, and it was good that Grandma got to die at peace. As for Grandpa, I guess I'll just have to wait for the day when a new one shows up. Hopefully, I won't have a body of my own to bury when he does. Probably the earliest memories I have of my life are story time. Dad would sit in his special seat in his room, and I'd sit cross-legged on the floor. Story time was important. Story time was special. Story time couldn't be skipped every night. It was a ritual. An event. I liked it mostly. He'd often read from picture books. He'd always shuffle in new ones, like stories about animals, leaves, gremlins, ghouls, talking clouds, all that good stuff. As a young kid, I didn't realize just how weird it was for him to have so many darn kids' books at his disposal. Back to Seth. Anyways, there was one important rule that always came with his nightly storytelling. Whenever he shared a tale, I wasn't allowed to get distracted. In the earlier years, it felt like he was much more lax about this. If I yawned or dozed off, he was pretty forgiving, but if I interrupted him saying I was hungry or bored or wanted to play video games, he'd shut me down quickly. He'd stare at me from his chair, an intense, angry glare. Then, with my full attention, he'd simply say, "What would the uninvited guests think about this?" Naturally, I didn't have a great answer to this question. At first, I assumed it was just an expression akin to saying it's raining cats and dogs. Some phrase that sounded like nonsense, but one that I'd understand when I was older. And either way, I ended up becoming a pretty good listener after months of this ritual, and started to really relish these moments with my dad. The stories themselves were boring, sure, but he'd always work hard to spice them up with great pacing and impassioned voice acting. It wasn't until I turned 9 that his storytime rules became much stricter. At this point, if I got itchy and looked down at my arm to scratch it, he'd snap his fingers, then glare. What would the uninvited guests think about this? If I noticed the snowfall happening outside, my eyes briefly darting to the window, it would be another snap of his fingers, another disapproving look, and another mention of uninvited visitors. I'd even learned to stare right at him, nodding intently at the appropriate story beats, while my mind was off wandering about something else. Still, he'd somehow be able to catch it. Innocently, I brought this up to some of my close friends at school, who found the whole thing, including the fact that he still read stories to me, nightly, even a bit weird. My curiosity flamed, and I brought it up to him at dinner one day. "Dad, why is storytime so important?" He didn't look up to answer, fork with mashed potatoes in one hand, that day's paper held out in front of him in the other. "It'll make you smarter. When you grow up, you'll be thankful about it." The answer didn't really quell my curiosity. I pressed on a bit more. "You really need me to pay attention the whole time?" "Yes, without a doubt." Not a particularly detailed answer from the old man. If this paints a strange picture about my pops, I do want to make something very clear. He was a great dad. He was always there when I needed him, whether it was for help on my homework or as a shoulder to cry on for something my 9-year-old self thought was the end of the world. He was supportive with all my hobbies, dorky as they were, and never seemed interested in forcing a particular worldview on me. There were only 2 topics he was guarded about: talking about my mom, who died giving birth to me, and of course the stories. Once I hit 10, he ditched the picture books altogether. The next stories were all ones he came up with himself. They were interesting, to say the least. I can recall a few of them that left greater impressions on me for reasons I'll get into soon. The first was the story about the werewolf who should have known better. This werewolf had sharp teeth, sharp claws, and a big heart like all the werewolves that came before him. He'd heard all the tales about townsfolk crying foul about the wolves and blaming them for various ills, but he brushed them aside. This werewolf was an optimist. One fateful day, he climbed down the hill to finally greet the townsfolk, but they chased him out with pitchforks and rocks. He realized quickly, much as he wished it weren't the case, that things hadn't changed. This story would be the same as those of wolves from generations past. The second story was about a boy who would freeze up in terror whenever there was an earthquake. Rather than dropping under the table and covering his head as he was supposed to, he'd instead stop in place, unable to move an inch. Noticing this, his mother decided to calm him with a story. Earthquakes big and small, she told him, were all caused by a friendly giant in the sky. Small rumbles meant the giant was exercising, and bigger quakes meant the giant was bouncing on a trampoline. The stories were silly, but they helped the boy find some relief, and soon he was able to consistently drop, cover, and hold, all while visualizing a fantastical picture in the sky. The most important story of the bunch was one he decided to save for a special night. At this point, I become the perfect listener. It was routine and instinct, and nothing could distract me. Even as my dad's storytelling antics got stranger and stranger. He'd turn the TV on midway through a tale and start slowly lifting the volume. He'd walk around the room as he spoke, bouncing a ball against the wall with increasing force. And strangest of all, he'd sometimes bring large stuffed animals into the room that he would hide behind as he told the story. Rastin Dosmuli Profund readily slipped up. Sometimes the face of a particular stuffed animal would pop out to me, or my eyes would be drawn to follow the movement of the ball he was bouncing. He'd always catch me, he'd always notice, he'd always say the line, "What would the uninvited guests think about this?" Finally, I asked him, "Who are the uninvited guests?" He broke into a big smile. It stretched across his face with an unsettling curve like a caterpillar, like his cheeks were being pulled. Then he shook his head. "There's still time," he said. And there was indeed. The night of the party wasn't for a few weeks. When it finally rolled around, it was a sight to behold. I never knew my dad had so many friends. They were all laughing, friendly, mingling, shaking hands, looking at the pictures around our house, eating. a gathering of sophisticated-seeming adults. None of them paid much attention to me at first. We assumed this event wasn't a big deal. Dad had mentioned briefly that some folks might come over to our house in the near future. I still remember the look on his face when they arrived. It was an expression I'd never seen him wear before. He tensed up, a half smile on one side of his face. His eyes looked like they were welling up with tears as he squinted. I never quite knew what it meant. After dinner, the guests all started breaking off into some strange behavior. A few of them were staring up at the ceiling in our living room, spinning ever so slightly in place as they did. I saw a group of 5 or so just standing in the bathroom, not really doing anything. One of the guests, a gentleman in a fine suit, started climbing up the stairs on all 4. When he got to the top, he'd walk back down to the bottom, and then start again. A few others followed him. It didn't dawn on me that something was wrong until I saw one of the strangers' smiles, dripping blood. I thought my brain was making things up, but then someone down the hall looked at me and waved with a similar tinged smile, red droplets flicking down from her teeth. I saw it more and more upon the guests and cried for my dad. He found me, grabbed my hand, and pulled me into his room. I heard him mutter to himself in a whisper and shut the doors behind him and barricaded the entrance as I continued crying. "It's story time, all right?" he said. I was rattled beyond belief, but the words brought me a light comfort. He sat in his special chair, the one he always sat in. Then he told me the story about Patrick Bear and the uninvited guest. I breathed and tried my best to listen intently. On one special day, Patrick found out that he was throwing a party. That was news to him. I felt a force pushing against the door. The guests rolled in one by one, more than he could have ever imagined. They were already inside. They spilled into the room, wandering. I averted eye contact with them. My dad shot me a knowing, mindful look. I was doing what he wanted. They had big hats and big ties and fancy shoes. But Patrick Bear didn't care. A clutter of strangers gathered behind my dad's seat. They peeked their heads out to look at me. The others started sitting around me in a circle. They left only a small gap for me to lock eyes with my father. Through my blurry peripheral vision, I could sense all of their eyes were fixed on me. Patrick just wanted his alone time, so fancy friends didn't mean much to him. The whispers of the strangers were the hardest part. "Look here, do you want to have a staring contest?" "Look away for just 1 sec," they all said in different variations. The guest stayed longer than he would have liked. The bloodied smile of a stranger crept up right in front of me. I kept my dad's gaze with a 2-inch gap to the stranger's left that had been afforded me. But eventually, I saw my dad's neck slowly twist. His eyes had averted from me. They looked upwards now towards a woman that was hovering in front of him. I heard cracks and snaps. The strange caterpillar smile returned to his face as his cheeks pulled in opposite directions. Blood pooled from his mouth. He briefly looked at me again now with an apologetic gaze. "I'm sorry, my sweet one. I had to look at your mother." His face and neck contorted in ways that didn't even make sense, but he was able to slip out one final line. Something in my gut knew that closing my eyes wasn't the answer. I was covered by the strangers, but still, I somehow looked ahead. Somehow they were a blur. I couldn't look away from them, but my attention wasn't with them. It was with the story, but eventually they all went home and Patrick Bear found peace and quiet once again, I said. A breeze blew through the window. The room was suddenly still. The house was empty. Everyone was gone. There was no sign of anything. No family photos, no children's books. Nothing I recognized, just generic furniture. When the cops found me days later, starved and confused, the story was that I was an orphan boy with no traceable lineage. Everything I told them about my dad, my upbringing, story time, and more couldn't be proven in any way. I talked about my school, about the teachers and friends I had there, but no one mentioned could recall ever knowing me. For a while, I was convinced that I'd made up the whole thing in my mind, that I'd been abandoned by my parents when I was young, fled from an orphanage, and squatted in uninhabited properties living an imagined life. A storybook of my own. The events of that final night of story time and the insanity I encountered were proof that I'd merely decoupled from reality as a child. Unfortunately, like the werewolf, I learned a painful lesson when my wife Meredith died while giving birth to our son Michael. Through the sheer shock and horror of it all, I tried to convince myself that it was just a disturbing cosmic coincidence. But then a package from nowhere arrived at my front door a few weeks after her passing. It was a fully illustrated storybook. It was called Michael Bear and the Uninvited Guests. On the first page, in the inner lining of the book, there was a note scribbled in it. It read, "We can't wait for the party. We'll bring all our friends. Love, Meredith, Mom and Dad." I can't say for certain when the party will be, but if history is anything to go on, the uninvited guests will show up around my son's 10th birthday. And so to prepare, we do story time every night. After all, it's important, it's special, it can't be skipped, it's a ritual, an event. And every time he complains about it, I give him the reminder. What would the uninvited guests think about this? Every time I kiss someone, I see how their last relationship ended. This time, I witnessed more than I bargained for. Abraidas and all started with Johnny Wellington. We were in middle school. I'd worn a white sundress that day and my hair was tied up in a ponytail. Johnny kissed me on the playground, his lips barely gracing mine for a moment before he ran off with his friends as they all giggled and poked fun at him. That was my first kiss, and the first time I came to the realization that I was different. The only way I can think to describe it is by saying that the second his lips touched mine, it was almost like they were telling me a silent story, a warning camouflaged in the form of affection. It was only a flash, but I could clearly see why his last relationship ended with Shelley Frankenworth. She had caught him talking about her in the library. "So did you kiss her yet?" Jonah asked. Leaning against the teen fiction books, his arms crossed over his chest. "Yeah, and I wish I hadn't," Johnny said, shoving his finger down his throat in a barfing motion. "I don't know what she had for lunch, but she tasted like tuna salad." On the other side of the bookshelf, Shelley heard him, her hand freezing midair. The book she was holding toppled to the ground. A series of unfortunate events by Lemony Snicket. Ironically, that was a very unfortunate event. She broke up with him the next day and told all the other girls that he had Cody's. Cody's were the least of my worries, though. These visions were 10 times worse. I couldn't kiss anyone without being instantly disgusted with them. I never felt the usual fireworks that everyone else did, because my mind was always reminding me why I shouldn't date them. My next kiss was in one of the back corner booths at Shiley's. I know real romantic. Something about their bottomless wings just really sets the mood. You know, I was 15 and he was 16. I remember being a bit tense all throughout the date, knowing that he would probably make a move. We had been on 3 dates now, and although I was still a little unsure about him, I did like him. That was until I kissed him. His lips on mine was what sealed the deal. "Peter, I just can't do this." Blonde curls hung limply over her shoulders, her blue eyes watery, and her nose red. A bit of snot coated her upper lip. She had been crying all night. Mascara ran down her cheeks in thin black trails. This poor girl looked like she had been through the ringer. "Come on, Grace." "It was an accident." He paced back and forth, his hands carting through strands of auburn hair. It didn't even mean anything. Grace's arms shook as she crossed them. I could tell that she still loved him, but she wanted to hold her ground. At this point, it looked like a losing battle, her lip trembling and her mind wavering, her sanity hanging on by a thread. But it still happened. She blew out a shaky breath. It still happened, and nothing you do or say will change that. He had cheated on her. The second I pulled back from that kiss, my eyes searched his for a moment, hoping that I would still see the boy from before, but all of that had been tainted. Ruined in a matter of seconds, I threw my napkin on the table and dashed out of the restaurant, leaving him to pay the bill. It's the least he could do. He deserved whatever karma he had coming for him. I didn't kiss anyone else until I was 23. Something about those numbers catapulted my biological time clock into action, and I was certain that if I just went on enough dates, I'd find one guy that hadn't screwed up terribly enough for me to stick around. I went on 15 dates before I struck gold. Or at least that's what I thought. Spencer Lancaster was everything that I wasn't. And that's what initially attracted me to him. He was outgoing, charming, and could work any room that he walked into. He could strike up a conversation with a complete stranger and make it seem like the most natural thing in the world. So when he reached out to me and asked to go on a date, I jumped at the idea. The date went well, but they always went well. Up until they kissed me. We talked about something funny that had happened to him at the grocery store the other day and laughed about his horrible stash of pickup lines. By the time we had finished our dessert, it was so late that the restaurant practically kicked us out. We shot each other a look as we strolled down the sidewalk before both of us burst into laughter. "Do you notice the way that lady kept circling our table?" Spencer asked, a lopsided grin spilling out onto his features. "Oh, you mean when she practically stared holes into the back of our heads?" Another giggle bubbled up from my lips. "Pretty sure she wanted us gone like 30 minutes ago." Don't worry about it. I left her a good tip. His shoulder brushed against mine for a second, playfully nudging me. "Handsome and generous," I murmured teasingly. I usually wasn't this open and lighthearted because I knew what the outcome would probably be, but something about Spencer was just so easy. Liking him was effortless. You give me more credit than I deserve. His lips tugged up again, perfectly white teeth flashing me a Hollywood smile, as his arm came up to rest around my shoulders, pulling me close. For just a moment, I allowed myself to let my walls down. I leaned into the warmth of his embrace, and for a second, I threw caution to the wind. As we walked around the square, continuing our playful banter, it didn't take us long to notice that all the other shops around us were closing. So Spencer proposed an idea. He said scratching the back of his neck before shuffling. In place a bit. This was the first time I'd seen him even remotely nervous. I don't mean for this to sound forward, but is there any chance you might want to come back to my apartment for a bit? I still don't know if it was the 3 glasses of wine, or the way that he was able to put my mind at ease, but I found myself shaking my head yes before my brain could even register what I was doing. In fact, all logic had flown out the window. Spencer's apartment was nice and quaint and unusually immaculate. In fact, it smelled like he had scrubbed the place down top to bottom with bleach. Now, I know what you're thinking. That should have been your first red flag. Listen, I know. I was stupid and slightly tipsy, and hindsight is 20 healthy. I couldn't help the way that my nose twisted up when I walked in, though, and Spencer was quick to catch on. Hey, yeah, I apologize for the smell. His hand once again came up to awkwardly rub the back of his neck. I was in a rush to get a stain out of one of my white dress shirts and spilled almost a whole bottle of bleach in the process. An awkward laugh left his lips as something akin to embarrassment burned at his cheeks. Let me just pop open a window real quick. He dropped his keys in the bowl beside the door. In the meantime, you can just make yourself at home. I kicked off my heels at the door, treading across the hardwood and plopping down onto one of his couches. Both of them were a light shade of gray. In fact, gray was a recurring color scheme in his apartment, except for the occasional pop of navy. As I waited, I couldn't help but glance around his apartment. Instead of pictures or knickknacks, I was met with strange, abstract pieces of art. One of them was a vase shaped like a hand. He didn't strike me as the type of man to enjoy the fine arts, but then again, who was I to judge? When he finally strolled back into the room, he nodded towards the fridge and said, "You want some water?" "No, I'm good, thank you, though." My fingers came up to tuck a stray strand of hair behind my ear. The open windows were making the apartment a little drafty. As he cracked open the fridge, I shifted uncomfortably in my seat. Something was poking me, and it felt sort of sharp. I reached up under me, digging around until I found the culprit. A shiny, gold hair clip stared up at me before it was quickly snatched from my grasp. "Oh, sorry about that." Spencer laughed, tossing it into the little hand-shaped vase. "My sister stayed here for about a week, and I'm still finding stuff that she's left behind. Insert red flag number 2. Don't worry about it." I patted the seat next to me and smiled. Is she younger or older? The rest of the night was spent talking about our family issues and sharing another bottle of wine. Ironically, not only were Spencer and I the oldest siblings, but both of our mothers believed in the power of the essential oil propaganda. I jokingly told him that bleach would give him cancer, the smell still assaulting my nose from time to time, and he was quick to reply back with, "Well, next time I'll just douse my shirts in." "Lemongrass," I chimed in, giggling. "Oh, but of course, haven't you heard that it works wonders?" The corners of his lips tugged up as he watched me laugh even harder. Sometime between all the playful banter, we had grown closer to one another on the couch. Both of us were probably a little more than tipsy at this point, and what was flirtation in the beginning transitioned into something else over the course of the night. I think some part of me knew that if I kissed him, I would find something I didn't like, so for the next half hour, I purposely avoided it. Just for once, I wanted to enjoy myself. I wanted to feel something other than disappointment, so when he carried me to his bedroom and hinted at something other than kissing, I was more than game. When I woke up the next morning, I turned over and stretched my arm out across the bed to find that his spot was empty, and then I smelled it. Fresh coffee and something that smelled a whole lot like French toast. My stomach growled as I stood from the bed and looked for my clothes from the previous night. After searching the room, I stopped and blushed, the warmth creeping up my neck and blooming across my cheek. A memory from last night flashed through my mind. My dress had come off long before we even made it to the bedroom. As for actions, I was quick to find a solution. My fingers coming through the t-shirts in his closet. Surely he wouldn't mind. My fingers stopped when I landed on one that was pink. The sweater was oversized and embroidered flowers crept up one of the sleeves. With a peek at the tag, I smiled. The sister had good taste. It was a small boutique in town. I slipped it on padding into the kitchen. Spencer stood at the stove, a spatula in hand, donning nothing other than some gray sweats and a hand towel thrown over his shoulder. My arms encircled his waist as I buried my head into his back, kissing the skin between his shoulder blades. A small chuckle left his lips. "Hungry, starving," I replied, standing up on my tiptoes to teasingly bite his shoulder. "Hey now. It's kiss the cook, not bite him." Spencer placed the spatula on the countertop as he swiftly spun around and pressed his lips to mine, his hand coming up to cut my cheek, successfully locking me in place. Please don't do this." Her voice begged as strangled sobs broke free from trembling lip. "You've seen too much." Spencer peered down at the girl, a maniacal gleam in his eyes as he pinned her to the couch. "I promise," the girl stuttered over her words. "I won't tell anyone." That's what the last one said. And she almost got me in trouble. Spencer was quick to search the room before his eyes landed on a pillow. "Leah, I'm sorry, but I'm not gonna make that mistake again." The girl thrashed and screamed, her fist flying up to smack him in the face. I heard him curse under his breath as blood dripped from his nose and landed on the collar of his white button-down. Anger flared within him as he tried to restrain her, but whoever she was putting up one heck of a fight. As I moved closer, a silent spectator to the events that unfolded, I held a hand over my mouth and gasped. A golden hair clip was tugged from her hair, shoved in between the couch cushions, as he held the pillow over her face. Fear surged through me as I watched her struggle. I wanted her to live, to fight, but some part of me already knew how this was going to go. A few seconds later, I was right. When he pulled the pillow away, I froze. A pink, oversized sweater with embroidered flowers on one of the sleeves stared back at me. "Natalie? Hey, are you okay?" Spencer gazed down at me, his brows furrowed, concern etched into his features. "Did I lose you there for a second?" Baraxas was I stumbled away from him, bent over and puked all over the floor. Tears blurred my vision as I gripped the countertop. Everything around me was spiraling out of control. "Stay right there. I'm going to run to the bathroom and grab some towels. It's gonna be okay." The second he stepped out of the room, I grabbed my purse from the table next to his front door and took off running down the street. I wasn't wearing pants or shoes, and I'm sure my hair was a rat's nest, but all I cared about was getting home. When I finally made it back to my apartment, my feet were raw in my mouth, tasted of acid. I'd thrown up 3 more times on the way. The second I locked my door, I wiggled out of the sweater, ripping it over my head and tossing it to the ground. I paced my apartment for a good hour before I finally placed the phone call. Ration, see sure. I've had to every time I looked at the crumpled mass of pink lying in a heap on the floor, something inside me churned, twisting and curling and choking me until I could barely breathe. 911. What's your emergency? I sat there for a moment trying to collect my thoughts. How in the world could I say this in a way that made sense? Hello? 911, what's your emergency? I started struggling to push the words past my lips. Excuse me, could you say that again? I'm having trouble understanding you. I knew how it sounded, but before I could stop myself, it was too late. Every time I kiss someone, I see how their last relationship ended. My hands shook as I fought to hold the phone steady. This time, I witnessed a murder. Julia and Geraldine were best friends, but they had very different personalities. Julia was brave and fearless, while Geraldine was shy and frightened of everything. It was Halloween night, and the girls were having a sleepover at Geraldine's house because her parents were out of town. In fact, every time Geraldine's parents went out of town, they had a sleepover because Geraldine was nervous about sleeping alone in the house, even though she knew there was nothing to be afraid of. It was a big, gloomy house, set way back from the road. When Julia arrived and rang the doorbell, Geraldine answered the door and ushered her inside. The girls changed into their nighties. Julia was wearing a beautiful silk nightgown. It was blood red and had a furry collar. Geraldine thought it was gorgeous and wished she had such a beautiful nightgown. The girls made some popcorn and settled down on the sofa to watch a scary movie. When it was over, Julia was tired and Geraldine was a bit scared, so they decided to turn off the TV and go to bed. As they walked up the stairs, they got the strangest feeling that something was following them. They ran upstairs and slammed the bedroom door. Then, they laughed at each other for being so silly. It was shortly after midnight, and the 2 girls were lying in bed chatting. All of a sudden, they heard a faint noise from down below. It sounded like something was moving around down there. Scritch, scritch, scratched. They stopped talking and looked at each other wide-eyed. There was an uneasy silence. Then they heard the noise again. It sounded like fingers scraping down a chalkboard. Scritch, scritch, unschritch. Julia sat up in bed. Listening intently, Geraldine hid her head under the covers. "It's only a cat," Julia whispered. "I'm going down to see." "Don't," Geraldine begged. "Please don't leave me, Julia. Don't be so childish." Julia snapped. "Whenever anything fun happens, you get the shivers down your spine." "Please," Geraldine whined. "If you're so frightened, I'll lock the door from the outside and take the key with me," Julia assured her. "That way no one can get in." "I hope it's a burglar. I'll give him the fright of his life." Julia got out of bed and felt her way to the door in the darkness. She slipped out into the hallway and quietly closed the door behind her. Geraldine listened as she turned the key in the lock. She heard Julia's soft footsteps going down the stairs. Then she heard the noise again. It sounded like a knife being sharpened. Scritch, scritch, scritch. Geraldine lay there in the darkness with the bedclothes over her head. She was sick with fear and trying to be as quiet as a mouse. All she could hear was the very stillness of the house. She wanted to call out Julia's name, but she didn't dare. Geraldine waited for what seemed like an eternity. After a long silence, she heard the noise again. It seemed to be moving now, coming up the stairs, getting louder and louder. Scritch, scritch, scritch. Then it stopped. Geraldine thought she heard someone standing on the other side of the door. Scritch, scritch. She heard the key turn in the lock and the door creaked open. "Julia?" she asked. "Julia, is that you?" She couldn't see a thing in the darkness, so she reached out with both hands. She reached out and felt a soft silk nightgown. Then Geraldine reached up higher, and to her relief, she felt the furry collar. It must be Julia, she thought. But when she reached higher again, she felt something wet and warm. There was nothing there, nothing but a bloody stump where her friend's head had once been. Early the next morning, when Geraldine's mother and father returned home, they were shocked by what they found. And inside the front door, there was a large pool of blood and a trail of blood drops led up the stairs. The frantic parents rushed upstairs, following the trail of blood that led to their daughter's room. When they opened the door, the poor couple stood there, appalled at the loathsome sight that met their eyes. Julia's headless body was stretched out on the floor. They found Geraldine hiding in the closet. Her hair had gone white and she was babbling and raving like a lunatic. She had gone completely insane. Later that day, the police found a confused man wandering around the countryside. He was dressed in a white hospital gown and he had blood all over him. In his hand, he was clutching a bloody knife. It turned out that he was a homicidal lunatic, and just the night before, he had escaped from the local insane asylum. Ironically, it was the very same insane asylum where Geraldine would spend the rest of her life. There was a woman named Suzanne who lived in an old house on a cliff overlooking the sea. She was divorced from her husband. Suzanne had been deeply depressed ever since her son Bobby drowned. She was devastated by the loss and felt like she couldn't go on. As time went by, Suzanne began reading books about black magic and Satanism. The more she read, the more she became immersed in the world of the occult. It was like an addiction. She came across a spell that was supposed to be able to resurrect the dead. One dark night, she drew a pentagram on the floor of her living room. Lighting some black candles, she stood in the middle of the pentagram, and at the stroke of midnight, she read aloud from an ancient satanic book. "Come fulfill my desire and do my bidding in accordance with my will. I conjure thee in the name of Satan, to whom all evil is obedient, by which name the earth is overthrown, the seas turn black, the ground shudders, fire is quenched, and all host of things in heaven and hell do tremble. Lucifer, prince of darkness, return my son who drowned by accident. Return him to me now, I command thee." Afterwards, Suzanne blew out the candles, she collapsed to her knees and began to weep. For all of a sudden, she heard a faint scratching on her front door. Cautiously, she walked over to the door and listened. The scratching grew louder. "Who's there?" she cried. There was a long silence, and then she heard a voice whisper, "Mommy." Suzanne opened the door and was shocked to see a small boy crouched on the doorstep. He was soaking wet and shivering with the cold. "Bobby," she cried. "It's you. It's really you." She hurriedly brought him inside and put a towel around him, trying to warm him up. His teeth were chattering and his hands were shaking. "I was so lonely and desolate without you, Bobby," she said. "Where were you? What happened?" "Remember water," he said. "Cold water, and I couldn't breathe. I woke up and couldn't remember who I was. I walked and walked in the rain. These people found me and they took me in. I didn't know if I was alive or dead." "You're alive, Bobby," she cried. "You're really alive?" "Was I a good boy, Mommy?" Bobby asked. "Of course you were a good boy," she replied. "Did you love me, Mommy?" Bobby asked. "I do love you," she replied, "from the bottom of my heart." "Were you nice to me, Mommy?" Bobby asked. "Of course I was," she said. Bobby stared at her. It was a mean, angry stare, and there was a spiteful sneer on his face. "It frightened Suzanne. I want to play a game with you, Mommy," he cried. "Hide and seek." All of a sudden, he raced up the stairs. All of the lights in the house went out. "Bobby, what are you doing?" she cried. "Where are you?" There was no answer. "Bobby, stop this," she cried. "I want you to come right back here. Bobby, please don't do this to Mommy." "Bobby, for the last time? What are you doing?" Just then, she heard the boy's voice coming from the darkness. "Aren't you glad the lights are out?" Mommy said. "It makes the game more fun. You're gonna hurt yourself in the dark," Suzanne replied. Suzanne cautiously walked up the stairs, feeling her way in the darkness. When she got to the top, she looked around, straining her eyes to see. "Bobby, stop this now," she shouted. "You're making Mommy very angry." All of a sudden, the door burst open and Bobby was standing there, Cackling like a maniac, in his hand he held a long, sharp kitchen knife. "Let's play hide and seek now. Mommy," he shrieked. Suzanne recoiled in horror. Backing away, she tripped and went tumbling down the stairs. When she landed at the bottom, she looked up and saw her son coming down the stairs with the knife raised above his head. "You lied, Mommy," he said. "Bobby didn't really drown by accident. You knew that. Bobby drowned himself. He couldn't stand the way you treated him, and he killed himself just to get away from you. Don't you see? Bobby didn't want to come back, Mommy. No, Bobby hates you, Mommy. He didn't want to come back, so he sent me instead." Just then, there was a flash of lightning and it lit up the house. For one terrible moment, Suzanne saw the face of the thing that had come back instead of Bobby. The Girl in the Mask is a scary Halloween story about a young girl who asked her babysitter for ice cream. There was a little girl named Holly who had just turned 6 years old. One Halloween night, her parents decided to celebrate their wedding anniversary by going out to a nice restaurant for dinner. Because it was Halloween, they had some trouble finding a babysitter for their daughter. Eventually, they called a teenage girl named Jessica, who lived down the street, and asked her if she could babysit for them. When Jessica arrived, the parents gave her their mobile phone number and told her to call them if there was an emergency. After they left, the babysitter fixed Holly some dinner and then sat down on the sofa to watch TV. When Holly finished eating, she asked, "Can I have some dessert?" "Okay," replied Jessica. "What would you like?" "Ice cream?" said Holly, smiling from ear to ear. The babysitter got up and searched through the fridge. "I can't find any ice cream here," she said. "It's in the freezer in the basement," said Holly. Jessica opened the basement door and flicked the light switch, but the lights didn't turn on. She carefully made her way down the creaking steps into the basement. She eventually found the freezer and lifted the lid. As she took out a tub of vanilla ice cream, she happened to glance out the window. In the darkness, she saw a little girl with long blonde hair standing outside. The girl had a red t-shirt on and was standing with her back to the window. Jessica couldn't see her face, but she noticed that the girl was wearing something black on her head. The babysitter didn't pay much attention. It was Halloween night, and there were a lot of children wandering around the neighborhood. She made her way back upstairs, put some ice cream in a bowl, and placed it in front of Holly. The little girl made a face. "Can I have some chocolate syrup on it?" she asked. "Okay." "Where's that?" asked Jessica. "In the basement," Holly replied. Jessica dutifully made her way back down into the darkened basement. As she was searching for the chocolate syrup, she glanced out the window again. The little girl was still standing outside, but this time, she was facing the window. Jessica saw that she was wearing an unusual mask. It was black with red trim, and the mouth was covered in large, sharp white teeth. It gave Jessica the creeps. The babysitter retrieved the chocolate syrup and walked back up the creaking stair. In the kitchen, she poured the chocolate syrup on Holly's ice cream. "Thanks," said Holly. "Can I have some candy sprinkles on it too?" Jessica sighed. "Let me guess, they're in the basement." "Yeah," giggled Holly. The babysitter headed back down the stairs, into the darkened basement. As she rifled through the cabinets, she looked out the window and saw the same little girl in the mask standing outside. This time, the child was holding a large knife in her hand. Jessica became very uneasy. She tried to rationalize it. Perhaps it was part of the little girl's costume. However, it seemed odd that a child's parents would allow her to go around at night, armed with a knife. Shuddering, Jessica found the candy sprinkles and ran up the stairs, taking them 2 by 2, anxious to get out of the basement. "Thank you," squealed Holly happily as the babysitter shook the candy sprinkles on her ice cream. "All it needs now is a cherry on top." Jessica stared at Holly in irritation. "Are you sure that's all it needs?" "This is the last time I'm going down into that basement. I promise," grinned Holly. The babysitter slowly descended into the darkness and opened the cabinet and found the cherries. Looking out the window, she noticed that there was no sign of the creepy little girl in the mask. Jessica breathed a sigh of relief. She was glad the girl was gone. The whole situation was beginning to freak her out. She picked up the package of cherries and climbed up the stairs for the last time. As she entered the kitchen, she was greeted by a horrible sight. Holly lay face down in her bowl of ice cream. A pool of blood was spreading out around her on the table. Her little throat had been sliced open. Jessica screamed and dropped the cherries. She ran into the bathroom and locked the door behind her before dialing 911. She sat on the floor, tears streaming down her cheeks, desperately waiting for the police to arrive. After what seemed like an hour, she heard sirens outside and the sound of the front door being broken down. A policeman's voice called out to her, and she unlocked the bathroom door. The police searched the house, but there was no trace of any intruder. A few minutes later, Holly's mother and father arrived. They were horrified to see their young daughter's corpse being carried out on a stretcher. The father sat on the steps outside, his head cradled in his hands. The tearful mother approached Jessica. Her eyes were red from crying. "What happened?" asked the mother. "Oh God, I'm so sorry," said the babysitter, trembling with emotion. "I was down in the basement. I looked out the window. There was a little girl in a mask. She had a knife. She was just standing there outside the basement window. She must have murdered Holly." "But Jessica, that's impossible," said the mother. "There aren't any windows in the basement. Only a mirror." Sticky Notes is a scary story about a girl who is home alone and keeps finding creepy messages that have been left for her all over the house. One evening, a teenage girl came home from school and found the house empty. Her mother had left a sticky note on the fridge for her. It said her father was working late, her mother was out shopping, and her younger brothers were at soccer practice. She was alone in the house. The girl locked the front door, just in case. Then she put her mobile phone on the hall table, hung her keys on a hook, and went upstairs to her bedroom to change clothes. As she was getting undressed, she saw a sticky note on her bed. She picked it up and looked at the message. It read, "There is someone in the house." She assumed it was her younger brothers playing a trick on her, so she crumpled the note. "Okay, very funny, guys," she said. "What happened? Did you two miss soccer practice?" No one answered. "Hey, I know you're here," she yelled. "If I find out you two went through my stuff again, you're dead." The girl went downstairs to the kitchen to fix herself a snack. When she opened the refrigerator, she discovered another sticky note. It read, "There's nobody here but you and me." She dropped the note and said, "Hey guys, this is not funny anymore. Stop it." There was no answer. The girl went to the front door and tried the knob, but it was locked. She turned around to get her keys, but the hook she had hung them on was empty. Then, the girl glanced down at the hall table and saw that her mobile phone had disappeared as well. On the table, there was another sticky note. It read, "You're not going anywhere." She screamed and picked up the phone to call the police. There was no dial tone. She grabbed the phone line, and to her horror, as she realized it had been cut. There was another note lying by the phone. It read, "No phone, no police. No way out." Quivering with fear, the girl ran to the back door. When she tried to turn the handle, she found it was also locked. Just then, she spotted another note stuck to the back door. It simply read, "Look up." So she looked up and saw her pet cat speared through the heart and pinned to the ceiling with a kitchen knife. She screamed in terror and ran to the nearest window. She tried punching and kicking it, but she couldn't smash the glass. It wouldn't even crack. There was a sticky note on the window. It read, "You can't catch a break, can you?" The frightened girl desperately tried to think of what she should do. She needed a knife to defend herself. She ran into the kitchen, but when she pulled out the drawer, it was empty. All of the knives were gone, and in their place was yet another sticky note. It read, "Children shouldn't play with sharp things." She ran upstairs to her bedroom and locked the door. She checked inside the closet and under the bed. There was nobody there. She breathed a sigh of relief. Then all of a sudden, her TV turned on by itself. It was loud and static. On the screen, she found another note. It read, "Now I have you where I want you." The girl flew into a panic and started yelling and screaming, "Help! Help! Somebody help me!" Just then, she remembered her laptop computer. She flipped open the lid and quickly sent an email to her best friend. "Help! This is not a joke. Call the cops. There's someone in my house." Minutes later, she heard the sound of sirens outside. The police arrived and broke down her front door. 2 officers burst into her bedroom and found her cowering in the corner, shaking and quivering with fear. The police searched the entire house from top to bottom, examining every nook and cranny, but they found no one. As the officers were interviewing her, one of them spotted a sticky note attached to her back. He pulled it off and handed it to her. It read, "I was this close." Tap 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 is a scary Halloween story about a group of school children, a secret knock, and a crazed murderer on the loose. We'll tell you a story about something terrible that happened on Halloween. This story is true, so they say, and it made my hair stand on end just to hear it. Really, it all happened many years ago in my town, which at that time was just a little town between the mountains of Catalonia, Spain. The town was little more than a small square with a church, a park, a prison, and a school, with all the houses clustered around. The town was very proud of their school since it had been voted the best school in the province. It was the morning of October 31st, Halloween, and a class of students were doing arts and crafts in their classroom. Some were cutting skeletons out of sheets of paper. Some were painting vampire bats and others were drawing pumpkins. The students were all aged between 8 and 9 years old. Their teacher was a beautiful young woman who had only been working at the school for 1 month. While the children were having fun, Preparing the Halloween decorations, the teacher turned the radio to listen to the weather forecast. She was planning to organize an outdoor Halloween party for the kids later that day and wanted to be sure that it wouldn't rain. Suddenly, the weather forecast was interrupted by a news bulletin. This is an important announcement. A convicted murderer has escaped from the local prison and is on the loose. He is described as armed and very dangerous. Please do not attempt to apprehend him. The police will... The teacher rushed across the room and switched off the radio. Like, she did not want to alarm the children, but it was too late. The children had all heard the broadcast and were very frightened by the news. They knew that the prison was very near the school. The teacher tried to reassure them and told them not to worry. A few minutes later, the school principal made an announcement over the intercom. Attention all teachers. We have been informed that police are dealing with a very serious situation that is occurring right now in the town. All teachers are advised to lock the doors and windows of their classrooms until the police get this situation under control. I repeat, lock all doors and windows until further instruction. That is all. The teacher told the class to stay calm. She took out her key and locked the classroom door. Then she went around and closed every window, making sure that they were secure and nobody could get in. One little girl raised her hand and asked if she could go to the bathroom. The teacher didn't want to let her go, but the girl insisted. The teacher finally relented and gave her permission to go to the toilet. After all, it was unlikely that the murderer would come to the school. She told the girl that when she came back, she would have to give a secret knock at the classroom door. Then they would know that it was her and they could let her back in. The code was 3 taps and 2 scratches. Tap, tap, scratch, scratch. The girl left to go to the bathroom and the teacher locked the door behind her. To take the children's minds off the scary situation, she started telling stories. After 20 minutes had passed and the girl still had not returned, the teacher began to get worried. What's taking her so long, she wondered out loud. Suddenly, they could hear footsteps in the corridor. Everybody in the classroom froze, then they heard a noise at the door. Tap, tap, scratch, scratch. She's back, sighed the teacher in relief. She walked over and took out her key. What if it's not her? Asked one little boy who was shivering with fright. The teacher hesitated, her key inches from the lock. Again, they heard a noise at the door. Tap, tap, tap. Scratch, scratch. It must be her, said the teacher. She put the key into the door and unlocked it. Suddenly, the classroom door burst open, and a tall man was standing there. In his right hand, he was holding a knife, and in his left hand, he was holding the little girl's severed head. The escaped murderer came into the classroom, smiling from ear to ear. The children were trapped inside. All that could be heard in the corridors of the school were screams of terror and squeals of pain. In the chaos, the teacher managed to break a window and jump out. She barely escaped with her life and crawled to safety. The children, however, were not so lucky. When the police arrived, they found the murderer sitting in the middle of the classroom. The floor, walls, and ceiling were covered in blood. Little body parts lay scattered around him. He had chopped up every child in the class into tiny pieces. They found the headless body of the little girl in the third stall of the bathroom. The police figured out what had probably happened that cold October day. The escaped prisoner must have been hiding in the toilet when the girl was asking for permission to go to the bathroom. He must have surprised her in the stall and forced her to tell him the password. When she did, he cut off her head. Today, the teacher is in a psychiatric hospital. She never recovered from the incident and can't stop repeating over and over again. Ayuro tap tap tap, scratch scratch, tap tap, scratch scratch. The school was abandoned because parents refused to send their children there. There were too many bad memories. The school was left just the way it was when the murders occurred. They say that if you visit the old school building and go into the classroom, you can still see the blood still dripping down the walls. If you are brave enough, you could even go to the bathroom. Just tap 3 times and scratch 2 times on the door of the third stall. Then open it. You will see the headless body of the little girl sitting on the toilet. The Sickle is a terrifying and gruesome story about a murder that happens in a locked room and a mystery that remains unsolved. A married couple lived in a small house in Japan with their son and daughter. The son was very angry with his sister and wanted to play a really nasty prank on her. He decided that he would secretly videotape her on the toilet and then post the video online. He wanted to humiliate his sister in front of her friends. The boy hid a video camera under a towel in the bathroom. Minutes later, his sister went to the bathroom and locked the door behind her. She never came out again. Her mother started to wonder what was taking her daughter so long. She banged on the bathroom door and called out the girl's name but got no reply. Worried, she told her husband and eventually they managed to force the door open. What they found inside the bathroom filled them with horror. Their daughter was lying in a pool of blood on the tiled floor. She had been stabbed to death. Her face was so sliced up that she was unrecognizable and her tongue had been cut off. There was a bloody sickle lying on the floor beside her. The police were called immediately and they came to investigate the scene. Inspecting the bathroom, they found that it posed a mystery. The door had been locked from the inside. The window was securely latched and the bathroom was so small that nobody could have been hiding inside, lying in wait for the girl. So how was she murdered? The police saw that the only possible entrance was a small vent in the wall that measured only 10 inches by 10 inches. Nobody could have fit through such a small space. The police were absolutely stumped. They could not figure out how anyone would have gotten inside to kill the girl. The police carefully dusted the sickle for fingerprints, but unfortunately they found none. At this point, they felt that the case would never be solved. They questioned the mother and father, but when it came time to question the son, he was nowhere to be found. They searched the house and eventually found him curled up in a wardrobe. His eyes were wild and he was sobbing uncontrollably. His hands were shaking violently. They noticed that he was holding a video camera. Unable to question him, the police decided to review the videotape. What they saw in the footage would terrify them for years to come. They pressed play on the video camera, and the screen showed the young girl sitting on the toilet. When she finished and stood up, the police noticed some movement in the small vent behind the toilet. A tiny figure emerged noiselessly from the vent. It was carrying a sickle. The policemen could hardly believe what they were seeing. The figure measured only 6 inches in height. I jumped onto the girl's back, and before she had a chance to scream, it sliced open her throat with the sickle. Then it began stabbing the girl until she was dead. But the horror was not over. The tiny figure sliced up the girl's face and cut out her tongue. Afterwards, the figure approached the video camera. The figure's face was that of a gnarled and wrinkled old woman. It looked directly into the lens and hissed, "You're next." Then the tiny figure disappeared back through the small vent, carrying the girl's severed tongue. After watching the videotape, the police officers wiped tears from their eyes. Some vomited on the floor and one even lost control of his faculties and pooped his pants out of sheer terror. Today, the case remains unsolved, and the tiny woman has never been identified. The videotape still exists, but the police refuse to release it to the public. It sits in an evidence locker at the police station. The police call this case the Sickle Mystery and refuse to discuss it with the media. The Halloween Mask is a scary story about a boy who wants to impress all his friends with a scary costume at a Halloween party. Things don't work out as planned. There was a boy named Lenny who really loved Halloween. It was his favorite holiday and he always tried to celebrate it in style. Every year he would save up his money and buy the best mask, the best costume, the best decorations. This year was no different. Lenny was getting ready to go to a Halloween party at his friend's house. He got dressed up in a shaggy black coat, big black boots, and a long, flowing cape. Then he put on his Halloween mask and admired himself in the mirror. It was the scariest, most hideous mask he had ever seen. He was sure that everyone at the party would be terrified when they set eyes on it. He would be the envy of all his friends. When Lenny turned up at his friend's house, the party was already in full swing. He could hear the dull sound of music coming from behind the door. He rang the doorbell and his friend answered it. She greeted him and ushered him inside. He looked around the living room. Some people were dancing and others were talking, laughing, drinking, and nibbling at the buffet. There were witches, ghosts, skeletons, vampires, and zombies. None of the masks were very scary. Lenny was sure he had the best one. He stood there and waited for someone to comment on his mask. But nobody paid any attention to him. He was disappointed. Wandering around the room, he tried to give everyone a good view of the mask. He wanted them to be scared. He wanted to cause a stir. One girl tapped him on the shoulder and started talking to him. "Hey, who are you supposed to be?" she asked. Lenny tried to reply, but he found he couldn't move his mouth. The mask felt too tight. He was embarrassed, so he turned away and went into the kitchen to get himself a glass of Halloween punch. He tried to pull off his mask so he could take a drink, but it wouldn't budge. It seemed to be stuck fast to his face. He pulled and tugged on it, but no matter what he did, he couldn't get it off. Lenny was starting to get worried. It was hot inside the house, and Lenny could feel himself sweating under the mask. He needed to get it off. He needed to get it off now. Grabbing a knife from the kitchen drawer, he went into the toilet and locked the door behind him. He looked in the mirror and started scratching and tearing at the mask, but it really hurt. It was as if the mask was firmly stuck to his skin. Getting desperate, he took the knife and sliced into the mask, cutting off little strips of rubber and tossing them into the sink. Gradually, a queue formed outside the toilet and people started getting impatient, knocking on the door and calling out, "What's going on in there?" Lenny was in a panic and he tried peeling off the rest of the mask, but it stubbornly stayed in place. He couldn't understand what was wrong. What if it won't come off? He wondered. What if it's stuck on my face forever? He began hacking at the mask with the knife again and ripping off little bits. More and more people were banging on the door. Come on, they shouted. What are you doing in there? From inside the toilet, they heard Lenny shrieking, "It won't come off. My mask, it won't come off." The people gathered outside the toilet gave each other worried looks. One of the girls was puzzled. "Mask?" she said, but he wasn't wearing a mask.